thank you for that introduction. I want to thank all of you for not only for being here today, but for all of the work that you've done over so many years to raise public awareness of the importance, in fact, the imperative of active forest management and sensible resource management, and for charting a path to return to the policies that once protected our forests, and prospered our local communities, and generated revenues for our local governments. You know, the frustrating thing is that we had all of that once. This is not a theoretical discussion. We know how to manage the forest. We did so expertly for nearly 100 years. And in a period of just a few years, back in the 1970s, this was all thrown away, sacrificed on the altar of the green left. You know, you were warning of the disastrous effect of these 1970s-era laws and policies since you formed. In fact, you formed specifically to warn the public about the damage that these policies were doing to our forests. And for this, you were vilified by the left and by their mouthpieces in the media. You remember those days. The damage they were doing was hard to get people to grasp because the effects of abandoning our forests to benign neglect happen very slowly over a number of years. They happen silently, year by year, as morbid overgrowth gradually began to choke off the forests. Well, we've now lived with those laws for nearly 50 years, and the damage of these policies should now be obvious to anyone who takes a glance at our forests. It's easy to see, but it is somewhat harder to understand, to truly understand it. We need to go back to the days before active forest management, before Western civilization. Paleontologists tell us that before the last half of the 19th century, California lost between 4 and 12 million acres a year to catastrophic fire. 4 to 12 million acres a year. You see, that's how nature gardens. If you doubt that, just abandon your own garden for a few months, let alone for 50 years, and see what happens to it. Nature is a lousy gardener. An untended forest is no different than an untended garden. It will grow and grow and grow until it chokes itself to death, and then it will fall victim to disease, pestilence, drought, and ultimately catastrophic wildfire. And we have to keep reminding people that excess timber is going to come out of the forest one way or another. Either we will carry it out or nature will burn it out, but either way, it will come out. That's how nature does its gardening. In fact, when Juan Cabrillo dropped anchor in Santa Monica Bay, it was October 1542. Any of you from Southern California, you know what October means. It's the Santa Ana fire season. Almost 500 years ago, Cabrillo, the first European to set eyes on the coast of California, promptly named Santa Monica Bay the Bay of Smoke. Now, at the turn of the last century, we formed the U.S. Forest Service and gave it a very simple mission. Do a little gardening in our national forests. Carry out the excess timber before it can destroy the forests. And at the same time, we suppressed brush growth. We encouraged grazing. Every year, U.S. Forest Service foresters would mark off excess timber, and they'd auction it off to the highest bidder. Logging companies paid us, the federal government, to remove that timber. That made us money. 25% of the proceeds went right into the coffers of local governments that are affected by the public lands. Local governments like Tuolumne County, 25% of the timber auctions every year went into our local coffers. The other 75% went to the Forest Service and was used to improve our forests. And throughout the 20th century, that worked. The acreage lost to wildfire dropped dramatically from between 4 and 12 million acres a year to a very steady 1/4 million acres a year. The fires that did get out of control stayed out of the crowns. We had good timber roads providing emergency access to all parts of the forest to get equipment to a fire at once. Often, logging equipment was close by to cut the fire breaks necessary in the event of an emergency. Timber killed by fire was quickly salvaged while it still had commercial value. And once again, the proceeds were put back into our local governments and were used to replant the ravaged land before the brush could lay first claim to it. And this era of active forest management worked. It assured healthy and resilient forests for every generation to enjoy. It produced a cornucopia of commerce for our mountain communities, as well as a steady stream of revenues for our local governments. So I have just one question. Why, in God's name, did we throw all of that away? Well, you know why. Leftist environmental groups arose, not from our mountain communities, but from the cities, and they discovered they could raise a lot of money and attract a lot of votes from hopelessly well-intentioned but virtually clueless followers in our urban areas. They won a sweeping series of laws in the early 1970s, including the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act. They forced our experienced foresters in our land management agencies out of those agencies in favor of zealots who were determined to remove mankind from the management of our forests. And they succeeded. Today, these laws require an average of 4 years just to prepare the environmental impact statements before a forest management project can even begin. Endless lawsuits can draw out that time indefinitely. They cost millions of dollars to produce, more than the commercial value of the timber that we once sold. So instead of making the government money so that we could put it back into the land in our local communities, these projects end up consuming our forest management dollars. Now, as you all know, after a fire, a clock starts running on the salvage value of the dead trees. On a fast track, it now takes a year for the environmental review for timber salvage, usually much longer than that. And by then, of course, the timber's lost most of its salvage value. All you have to do is draw that out another year by filing a nuisance lawsuit or bureaucratic slow walking. It's got no value at all. So you can go ahead and put it out for bid. Nobody's going to buy it. Meanwhile, grazing is one of the most effective measures to control brush growth. Yet we've watched the same environmental laws and regulations used to discourage grazing through the national forest through a variety of different methods: above-market grazing fees, excessive liability exposure for ranchers, and when that fails, just outright harassment. A few years ago, we dealt with an issue in the Tahoe National Forest. The Levell family had been running cattle through there since 1931. And by all accounts, they had been excellent and responsible stewards of the land. With absolutely no warning, the Forest Service presented them with a letter declaring that they were in non-compliance because of cattle that occasionally stray off the land. Yet in the past, federal regulations prohibited them from building fences to prevent that very problem, and it turns out the cows can't read very well. Or if they can read, they really don't care. The Forest Service recently charged that the cattle were damaging aspen stands, allegations that further inspection proved to be groundless. So having failed to make its case on those grounds, the Forest Service came back and ordered the Levells to remove cabins that they've maintained and paid property taxes on for 79 years. We had another family, the Coughlin family. It also had its long-standing grazing permit canceled because of a lack of sufficient feed, as determined by a Forest Service biologist. Well, a subsequent field trip utterly disproved the biologist's opinion, so the Forest Service next simply informed them their permit's still in jeopardy because of the same wandering cows that it used as a pretense in the Levell's case. I recently saw an estimate that at present, we are only removing about 5% of the annual growth of our forests. 5%. Now think about that. If I delivered 20 newspapers to your house every day, and you only threw away one of those newspapers every day, how long would it take your home to become a fire trap? That's the condition of our forest today. The left now tells us, well, this isn't a lack of proper forest management, it's climate change. Their all-purpose go-to excuse for all of the damages that their policies have done over so many different sectors. Climate change. Well, again, remember, when Cabrillo noted the wildfires in 1542, the Earth was in a period that's well documented as the Little Ice Age. In that period, the Thames froze over every year, so thick that they used to hold an annual ice festival on it. Now, the climate is gradually warming, but any real climatologist will tell you that means more overall precipitation, not less. What we're dealing with are changing weather patterns. When climate change, you can now often tell the exact boundary lines between the public and private lands just on the condition of the forests on each side of that line. You can see it clearly from the air. How clever of the climate to know the exact boundary lines between the private and public lands and only decimate the public lands. I've got a memo to Mr. Newsom and Mr. Biden. If you actually think that if we all turn off our air conditioning and heating and all ride our bikes to work, that this problem is going away, you are completely out of your mind. 5 years after the King Fire, I toured the footprint by helicopter. The line between the private SPI property and the national forest, you could see absolutely precisely. On the SPI property, all the fire-killed timber had been removed. Young growing trees had been planted and were flourishing. On the national forest land, it had been completely abandoned. The blackened trees still stood there, drying out, ready to fall over on between 6 and 8 feet of brush that had grown up in the meantime, creating a perfect fire stack for a second-generation fire. In fact, we saw that graphically demonstrated during the Dixie Fire. The Dixie Fire burned over a portion of the Reading Fire from about 15 years ago that had been abandoned after the fire. The brush had grown up. The great trees started falling over on top of it, so you now had 6 feet of tinder with big dry logs on the top. When the fire hit that neglected land, it absolutely exploded. These laws and the endless regulations promulgated by them have got to change. And until they do, we will continue to watch our precious forests and our forest communities consumed by this final act of nature's cycle of destruction. And anyone who's waiting for the renewal part of that cycle will wait an exceedingly long time, since brush takes first claim on these lands and the forests take centuries to regrow. And you can see that across the Sierra of the forest, of the fire-ravaged lands that we've built up over these past 15 years. I imagine you could use some good news at this point, so let me offer this. First, public opinion is changing. People are realizing that these laws and regulations that promise to improve our forest environment for the last 50 years have been a lie. You can see that lie so clearly every time you look at our forests. As Chief Moore mentioned, 5 years ago, I was able to get into the Wind Act of 2016 provisions of my bill to provide the categorical exclusion from NEPA for forest thinning projects up to 10,000 acres. In order to get it past the Senate, we did have to limit it to the Tahoe Basin. But it has been implemented in the Tahoe Basin, and it has proven an enormous success. The largest timber thinning projects in recent decades are now being done under this new authority. It's taken the environmental review from these projects from 4 years down to just 4 months. It's reduced the reports from 800 pages down to just a dozen or so. And it was used effectively around South Lake Tahoe. As Chief Moore mentioned, when the Caldor fire hit the patches that were treated, it lay down, it slowed, and it was extinguished. Now, the forest supervisor who actually implemented this law in the Tahoe Basin is now the forest supervisor for the El Dorado Forest, And he's begging for these provisions to be extended to his forest as well. Now, he was begging in the months that preceded the disastrous Caldor fire that's still burning right now. And I've introduced legislation every session to extend the provisions of this bill now that they have been proven a success. I have to tell you at present, we can't even get a hearing before the House Natural Resources Committee. This is a bill that 5 years ago passed with bipartisan support in both houses and was signed by Barack Obama. The Congress has become so radicalized in the intervening time, we can't even get a hearing on it. But I can tell you this with increasing confidence. That's going to change 542 days from now. Not that I'm counting. You know, in the spring of 2013, I worked with Randy Moore when he was regional forester to raise the fuels reduction target by 8 million board feet, and he was very anxious to do that. This was because of the heavily overgrown status of the Stanislaus National Forest that was first pointed out by Supervisor Randy Hanville. He called it disaster waiting to happen, and indeed it was. On August 17, 2013, the Rim Fire erupted. Ultimately, it burned about 260,000 acres. And the supreme irony is this. Randy was not able to do that increase in board feet thinning because he was stopped by environmentalist lawsuits that were supposed to protect the spotted owl. And the irony is that when the Rim Fire came through, because we couldn't treat the forest earlier, it destroyed 46 of those spotted owl sanctuaries. Before the Rim Fire was out, we did a helicopter survey of the damage, and I asked Randy what's needed to expedite salvage, and he said the only path that he could see was legislation, which is I introduced. Meanwhile, the Forest Service did everything practicable to expedite NEPA, bringing all the experts throughout Region 5 to speed the process. And at the same time, TwoCare and local community leaders brought together a diverse group of stakeholders to consult and hopefully prevent lawsuit challenges to NEPA for the salvage. As I said, the Forest Service did get the EIS done in an amazing one-year time frame, but it was challenged in court. Some salvage occurred, but not nearly what could have been. And the value of that timber used for reforestation could have been used for reforestation had salvage started immediately, as was done on the private SPI lands. And then there's another issue, and that is the let burn policy of the Forest Service. On July the 4th, lightning struck a tree in the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest in Alpine County. It ignited a small fire that smoldered for days in about a quarter acre of rugged terrain. According to Sheriff Rick Stevens, California's firefighting agency, CAL FIRE, dispatched a crew to put it out. But they were told to stand down by the U.S. Forest Service, which proceeded to monitor the situation instead. Monitor, that means do precisely nothing. They did send a helicopter over every day to take pictures for their Facebook, but they didn't bother to drop any water from that helicopter. 12 days later, the Tamarack fire exploded out of control, consumed 70,000 acres, destroyed 23 homes, and did about $8.7 million of damage. And again, one of the ironies of this is that one of the towns in the path of the Tamarack fire was Woodford's, California. In 1987, they had exactly the same problem. The Woodford's Fire Department responded to a report of fire on Forest Service land near their town, and they too were turned away. Federal officials threatened Woodford residents with arrest for even trying to extinguish the small blaze on Forest Service land. Hours later, the fire exploded to 6,500 acres, costing 25 families their homes. This let burn policy began at the same time we got NEPA and ESA in 1972, during the height of the radical environmental movement. Essentially, it holds that fire is our friend. If fire comes through and ravages a forest, that is then classified as treated land for the future. In 1998, when this federal let burn policy produced the disastrous Yellowstone fires, President Reagan reversed it. In fact, at a press conference, he said, I didn't even know this policy existed. The minute that this happened out there, and Don Hodel, the Interior Secretary, went out there, he made it plain that no, we're withdrawing from that policy. And we did. The problem is, Reagan left, and the policy returned, and the devastation that it's caused since then is tragic, avoidable, and incalculable. It is absolutely dangerous nonsense to monitor incipient fires in today's forest tinderbox, even if they seem to pose no immediate danger. No person in his right mind would monitor a rattlesnake curled up in his bedroom because it wasn't doing anything at the moment. He'd kill it before it does. But this is where enlightened leadership can play a role, and where even without legislative change, regulatory change can be effected within the bureaucracy. We're very fortunate that our Region 5 supervisor, Randy Moore, was promoted like the next week to chief of the U.S. Forest Service. And one of his first acts as chief was to rescind the let burn order and instead to order initial attacks on all fires the moment they're spotted, at least for this season. So what I can leave you with is this. What you're doing matters. Public opinion is slowly turning in our direction, propelled by your good work and the mounting evidence that people can see with their own eyes. I cannot tell you that legislative change will occur this year, but I do have a high degree of confidence that we will see that change in the next Congress. And the more we can bring pressure to bear on the land management bureaucracies, the faster we can return to the days of resilient forests, fire-safe communities, and prospering mountain economies. Thank you all very much for everything you're doing. Just keep doing it.